So you might have recently seen the news surrounding Joe Biden invoking the Defense Production Act. This was done to increase domestic production of a range of critical minerals, including lithium, nickel, cobalt and graphite. I know that many are familiar with it. There's a lot of excitement surrounding many of these EV battery materials. And now you might be wondering, what does this mean for these EV battery material stocks, the developers, the producers? Are there implications on the growth trajectory for many of these? And ultimately, what is this Defense Production Act itself? Well, today we're going to define initially what critical minerals are, why they're so important to the national and economic well-being of nations, and then we'll also unpack what the Defense Production Act was and why there's such a focus on localization of supply chains. Of course, we know that the decarbonisation trend, the electric vehicle transition, and many of these sectors are running hot at the moment. But there has been a lot of excitement to try to understand what this recent piece of news could mean for the sector moving forward. We saw a significant share price reaction on the Friday session from many of these EV battery material stocks, namely the lithium companies. And so today we're going to unpack it all. Hope you enjoy the video. Park up, enjoy a cup of tea, and welcome. So let's discuss critical minerals. Before unpacking Joe Biden's invoking of the Defense Production Act and what this actually means in practice for many of the EV battery material stocks and the resources, it probably makes sense for us just to take that step back and have a think about critical minerals. What are they and why are they so important or critical to supply chains? So first and foremost, at that high level, critical minerals are resources that are critical for a nation or the global macroeconomics well-being. I think when we think about critical minerals, it's worth delineating between critical minerals and strategic minerals. Strategic minerals are those that are used either for defense or other strategic makeup and key capabilities of a nation, while critical minerals are those resources that are front and center, that are important for a nation just to be continuing on with its current modus operandi. And then I think it's worth understanding that there's two components to it. Not only are critical minerals important for a nation's economic well-being, but on the other side as well, there is a component of supply risk or supply uncertainty that makes the supply of critical minerals so important. Of course, as we know, supply risk can happen due to a myriad of factors, whether it's about scarcity of the actual minerals availability itself, whether it's geopolitical risks and uncertainty, or trade policy, as we've seen playing out and evolving with the situation in Ukraine, and of course the economic sanctions that have flowed through from that. And so with all of that understanding, there are a range of different critical minerals that have been defined in the United States, and different nations around the world have got critical minerals on their list that they deem as important. In the US, this was an initial list of 35 that was expanded out to now 50. But for the purpose of today's discussion, first and foremost, we'll be talking about many of these EV battery material resources, whether it's lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, manganese, many of which we've talked about at length on the channel. But that's where a lot of the excitement has centered around with Joe Biden's recent announcement. And so with that contextual understanding of critical minerals, let's have a think about, why do resources matter? Now, I know that many of you are familiar with the discussion we've had on the channel previously, but there really is a range of converging tailwinds that mean that particularly this decarbonisation trend that we're seeing around the world is bringing in significant demand and focus on some of these key metals. First and foremost, the first tailwind. Electric vehicle demand continues to grow. We're all familiar with the story, but it's picking up pace, it's coming online rapidly, and gigafactories continue to be put up and established and developed around the world. And of course, as we know, as factories are developed, they're going to need a significant amount of raw materials as well to help to facilitate the development of batteries or vehicles or whatever they're developing. And so this demand is driving demand for the underlying resources too. We also know that there's been pressure on global supply chains. Now, this has not only happened in the recent past, but we've seen it playing out, of course, with the lockdowns and the supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions that have had inflationary pressures throughout the system. But there's been even more importance over the past period with this focus on localization of supply chains. And we'll talk about how some of that has begun emerging over the past few years, particularly since Joe Biden won the election in November 2020. I think it's also worth noting as well that supply, at this stage, it can't come online fast enough. It's struggling to keep up with demand. Sure, eventually, it's likely as supply projects come online, we may meet an equilibrium, but it's going to be fascinating to see where that level does end up landing. And I guess another key factor that's quite intuitive, but it is worth referencing here as well, is that many of these resources are key to not only economic prosperity, but they also play at the intersection of the decarbonisation trend that we know is growing in importance over time. Just as a bit of an insight here, there's this visual annual lithium ion battery demand. We can see here out to 2030, it's going to continue to scale rapidly. Passenger electric vehicles, these of course uses a significant amount of not only lithium, but in their current compositions, whether it's nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite anode, they're using significant amount of these resources. And so as the EV demand grows almost exponentially over time, then we're going to obviously see significant demand for many of these resources as well. And so then that brings us to the recent discussion from President Joe Biden invoking the Defense Production Act. For a bit of history, this Defense Production Act was actually initially established in 1950 as a response to the start of the Korean War, but it has been used in recent times as well with the lockdowns and a range of different factors too. But President Biden has utilized it in this period of time to help to increase domestic production of critical minerals and metals needed for a range of advanced technologies. But of course, electric vehicles has been front and foremost in investors and analysts' minds with the potential implications that this could mean. It is worth noting that there is a breadth of critical minerals that fall under this list. However, as we've talked about, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, many of these got recent bids up on the Friday session after this Defence Production Act was invoked. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it actually plays out practically. Of course, we're still yet to see how it will flow through. There's a range of different discussions playing out and it's going to be very, very interesting. But it looks like it will be more of an active type investment rather than, say, passive support through subsidies or tax offsets. And so as a result of that, a lot of domestic producers in the United States, as well as those in allied countries, like we saw flowing through on many of the ASX listed companies, got a bid up because it is validation for the fact that critical minerals are going to be important, that localization of supply chains is front and center in the discussion, and also that there is a significant undersupply at the moment in terms of many of these resources, particularly with the increased demand that's likely to flow through over the next decade and beyond. I'm keen to know your thoughts on it all too, so drop in a comment below what you made of Biden's recent decision, what you thought about the share price reaction from many of these stocks, and where do you think the EV decarbonisation trend heads from here moving forward. And so it is worth noting as well that this wasn't just a snap decision that was made. There has been a range of different inquisitions and focuses over this past period, particularly since the Biden-Harris administration came into power after the election in November 2020. Many of you will remember that there was an executive order for a 100-day supply chain review in fairly swift succession after they took power in February 2021. As you can see here, the focus of this review centered around the need to build resilient, diverse and secure supply chains for economic prosperity and national security. Really, these supply chains were there to, of course, help to localize supply chains, reduce the demand and exposure to global supply chains, but also to help to revitalize American manufacturing and onshoring a lot of these processes and bringing jobs back to America as well. And so with that context, you might be asking, okay, so what's the story? As we know, the focus now is to build a made-in-American supply chain. As many may be familiar with, for a lot of these resources, whether it's lithium, whether it's the graphite anode, whether it's nickel, a lot of the downstream processing, and in fact a lot of the upstream mining as well, is done in Asia, particularly in China. And so as this focus on localizing of supply chains becomes more and more important, think about resources like the rare earths as well, there's a big focus not only in the United States, but in nations around the world to localize supply chains, to build out more robust supply chains as well. And this decision surrounding critical minerals is going to help to facilitate that. As we all know, a lot of these resources are key inputs into clean energy technologies, not only electric vehicles, but batteries, wind turbines with a lot of the rare earth magnets, solar panels, and so on and so forth. But it is worth noting as well that not only are these key inputs, but demand is likely to grow. And depending on which forecast you're looking at, the White House here has indicated potentially a 4 to 6x over the next several decades. But there's even more bullish forecasts out there as well. So it's going to be fascinating to see how all of this plays out and emerges and how the supply and demand dynamic does play out as well. And so then how does it look in practice? This was some of the wording that was provided over the past couple of months from the White House. They stated that in addition to working with partners and allies to diversify sustainable sources, the reports recommended that there would be a focus on expanding domestic mining, production, processing, and recycling. So going all the way downstream and looking to build out those circular economies. And there was this laser focus on boosting strong labour, environmental justice, community engagement, and tribal consultation standards. So it is still early stages. As mentioned, we're going to wait to see how this flows through in practice. But it's going to be fascinating. It looks like there's going to be significant investment. A lot of course, the local and domestic supply chains and domestic producers or developers over in the US stand to be significant beneficiaries. But it is going to be very, very fascinating to see what this next chapter looks like as more and more governments around the world sit up and realize that this electric vehicle and decarbonisation transition is here and here to stay. And so then as we bring it all together and wrap it up, you might be wondering, what happens from here? And then most importantly, what are the implications for many of these EV battery material stocks themselves? First and foremost, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. Feel free to share it out. If you are new here, welcome. We make a daily video each and every day, so make sure you've subscribed, turn your bell notifications on as well, and you won't miss a daily episode. But then thinking about the companies themselves, of course, there are a range of different companies within the sector. Near-term producers are going to be affected differently to the early-stage developers that may actually have some support, whether on the financial or the capability side, flowing through from some of these decisions. Of course, we know that companies with domestic operations in the United States are likely to be the most exposed and the most clear-cut beneficiaries from this decision. But I think there are potential flow-on implications as well. If we think about the opportunities for other nations around the world, potentially Australia or other nations around the world that may take the US lead with a focus on critical minerals coming to the forefront of discussions. We know that there's the Modern Manufacturing Initiative in Australia. A range of companies have already been beneficiaries of this, and a lot of them saw excitement and uplift in their share price consequently as a result of that. But it also is worth being cognizant of the fact that we have a federal election coming up in May. It's going to be fascinating to see if the decarbonisation trend, potential support for the electric vehicle transition and other related industries is included in some of those policies and how they are approached. But it is going to be very interesting. Of course, there are a range of different companies with domestic operations in the United States that could stand to be near-term beneficiaries of this discussion surrounding the Defence Production Act. As mentioned, it is still in the early stages. There's no concrete finalised decisions yet or announcement, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. And I think first and foremost, what it is, as we've discussed already, it's that big tick. It's validation that this transition is here, it's arriving, governments are sitting up, they're taking notice, and they're willing to invest into this transition because they know how important it is. I'd love to know your thoughts on it all. Drop in a comment. We'll leave some links up above to other videos that we've done exploring the EV battery material space. And of course, before we go, as you all know, I'm just a bloke on the internet who loves talking about stocks. I'm obviously not a financial advisor and nothing we discuss is financial advice. Do hope, however, it is a fascinating starting spot for you to go away and do your own research from. Thank you so much for joining us. For now, stay well and happy investing.